My name's Chris Johnson, and this is Healthcare Tomorrow. Today we're joined by Rachel Turow, FDA regulatory lawyer, that is going to give us some good insight on all the changes with the FDA. Thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. There's just a lot going on with the FDA right now, and you have a unique perspective considering your experience. Would you kind of give us a little background of maybe starting with your education and then kind of going into some of your different stops that change the way and really kind of form how you look at the FDA?
Sure. So I did my undergrad at Stanford. I was a human biology major and actually had a former FDA commissioner as a professor, Don Kennedy, and did a lot of health policy work in undergrad, including spent some time in Washington at the Stanford and Washington program, and really kind of began to understand the larger ecosystem around healthcare in the United States. Then I decided to go to law school, and I did a joint degree in law and public health because I really wanted to understand both the intersection of law and our healthcare system at a very granular level. So I was lucky that the University of Michigan had a program like that. Went and graduated with a dual degree. And I have kind of an unusual path as a lawyer. Most people graduate law school, they go to a law firm, they go to the government. I went to a biotech startup and kind of cut my teeth as an in-house lawyer doing all sorts of things, many of which were not related to FDA. But one of the areas that was the most fraught for the company was the FDA issues. And I spent a lot of time doing promotional and marketing review. We had a bunch of drugs launch and regulatory approvals and kind of learned through that, and then had a outside counsel who was a mentor there. And because I'm a DC-based lawyer, when I thought it was probably time for me to try something new, he suggested I go work at FDA, which at the time, I was like, well, I guess that's a good idea. Everybody in Washington spends some time in government, or many of the lawyers do. So managed to get into the FDA through kind of a direct hire situation, which is unusual, and went to work for a center director. So I worked for the director of the Center for Devices for a couple of years, which was absolutely trial by fire. I didn't really know what FDA did when I went to FDA, and got thrown in with both user fee reauthorizations for devices, which it was in its second round of authorization at that point, and then writing guidance documents, writing rules, dealing with the Hill, all of that stuff was going on. But after a couple of years in the device center, I realized that I had spent all this time at a pharmaceutical company, and the issues around pharmaceutical products and healthcare are definitely the closest to my heart. So I went and worked at the Center for Drugs for a few years after that. But because I had device experience, I still did a lot with combination products, and then worked on all sorts of different issues related to drug compounding, 505(b)(2)s, which are follow-on small molecule products, and answered citizen petitions, wrote regulations, wrote guidance documents, and really got to know kind of the inner workings of FDA as a reg counsel there. And then when I left FDA, I went to work for Novo Nordisk and in doing policy work, which was another kind of pivot into the world, the policy machine of Washington. I worked a lot with trade associations, which I had not done previously, and kind of learned how lobbying works and policy works at the kind of consensus building level. But after a couple of years there, realized I really wanted to just do legal work. And so went to Teva and spent a number of years at Teva kind of doing regulatory legal work, and then also rebuilding their policy function. So kind of saw the intersection of both. And the legal issues at Teva are amazing from an FDA law perspective because they have so many generics and biosimilars, and some of the hardest legal questions you have to answer as an FDA lawyer are around follow-on products. So loved that, and then got the opportunity to go to Walmart and lead their regulatory legal team, and so got a lot of experience there with consumer products, also kind of seeing how FDA regulates the entire other world of things that you go and you buy in a store. So things like OTC drugs, dietary supplement, food, consumer medical devices, cosmetics, and dealt with a whole bunch of different, very interesting issues there. And then wound my way up 20 years later into big law, which has been, if you're going to go to a law firm, I highly suggest waiting 20 years to join a law firm because it's a much better experience. So now I spend a lot of time advising companies on FDA-related issues in all sorts of different business areas. So some of the work I do involves M&A. I also advise on litigation. There are a lot of trade issues right now that, especially with tariffs, that are impacting FDA-regulated products, and all of this goes back to regulatory strategy. And so kind of figuring out how the regulatory strategy solves the business problem has become my kind of niche after all of the years I spent in-house kind of understanding the nexus between legal and business.
So really, almost everything that you will come across.
Yeah.
You have kind of this catalog of experiences to pull from, whether you were at the FDA with the manufacturer and saying, well, it's not apples and apples, but it's pretty darn close. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the thing that you learn, like if you do regulatory law for a long time, is the construct is ultimately the same, right? It's the statute, it's the regulations, it's the guidance. I mean, when I was at Walmart, I dealt with all sorts of regulatory agencies, not just FDA. But FDA's kind of bottom line remit is a risk-benefit calculus around public health and making sure that whatever products are getting through FDA's pathways, whether it's a 510K clearance, whether it is as complex as a BLA, that benefit risk calculus makes sense. And so the more you understand that construct, the better it is to kind of understand what are the big ticket regulatory items that people really have to worry about versus what are the things that maybe they're a nuisance, maybe it's not as easy to get through FDA as you want, but you're ultimately going to get there, the product's going to reach the market. And so kind of understanding how to deal with all of those different nuances, and then also compliance programs kind of helping to understand what is important when you're putting together a compliance program, what are the things that FDA is going to care about, and how to keep companies out of trouble.
So considering your experience in running large legal teams, what has been the transition for you to being in a law firm and doing it really from the inside, from a law firm's point of view rather than a manufacturer?
Yeah, it is different. When you're in-house, the business goals are paramount. Right, the in-house lawyer is working hand in hand with the business, and ultimately, the business drives the decision making, and that is my philosophy as a lawyer, regardless. Because at this point in my career, that is how I have been trained, and that is how I've seen success. At a law firm, it's slightly different because most companies have competent in-house counsel to handle the day-to-day matters. So you're not doing project-based work where you start at the beginning and you see it all the way through to the end, and you get the product to the market, or you solve the problem, or you send the letter in and it's all done. The law firm work, you kind of popping in, you're giving an opinion, you're solving a quick problem, or you're dealing with a huge deal where one company's buying another and you have to look at the regulatory implications for that kind of transaction. Or it's litigation and there are regulatory related issues in the litigation, and so you're advising on those. So it's much more kind of subject matter expert based discrete work than it is when you are really in the trenches as a partner to the business. But either way, that kind of business-oriented approach, I think, has served me very well as a lawyer, because a lot of lawyers are seen as kind of just the department of no, and I really try hard not to be that person. So I think I've benefited a lot from kind of being out in companies and understanding really what matters, even down to I understand what, how people are going to react to our billing, and, making sure that, all of that goes as well as possible.
Do you think that your experience at the FDA in 2 different stints and 2 different avenues with different centers, both device and drug, do you feel like that experience helps you understand where things are going so you can kind of forecast and get a good sense of how all these changes are affecting those that are doing the jobs that you've already done?
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that being an FDA alum is valuable for is that the network is very small. So especially in the DC area, I spent a lot of time still talking to people who have just left the agency, who are still at the agency, who left the agency closer to when I did. And it's a small community. The FDA law bar is even smaller. And so being part of that community is very valuable in really understanding what is going on at FDA and how the changes, especially the changes in the new administration, kind of are impacting what is going on at the agency. But yes, it's very helpful to understand how, for example, a reduction in force might impact the day-to-day operations at the agency and whatever people are doing. Because from the outside, government titles are somewhat obscure. They're hard to understand. You think somebody who's a project manager is probably not doing all that much. They're doing everything. And so really kind of understanding, even getting rid of the policy staff, for example, you would think like, FDA policy, that's important, but it's not as important as the drug reviews. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Without policy, it is very hard to know where FDA is going, for example, because the policy staff writes the guidance documents, they write the regulations. And so the need for more, industry generally wants more transparency from the agency, and they want guidance. And so those changes are very impactful and are going to kind of be a challenge to navigate in the near term. I think eventually it will smooth out.
So that's personnel. I mean, that's infrastructure.
Yeah.
And those are major changes, yes. And we've seen that. What are some of the other changes that you're watching occur real time? And what do you think that's going to mean for those that are trying to get products through the system?
Well, so there's a lot of the changes are flowing down from the top, right? So you've got the Secretary of Health and Human Services was a very particular view of healthcare in the United States. You've got the MAHA Commission, which he chairs, and they just put out a report, I think last week, that really kind of gave a very good perspective of the types of things that they are focused on. And I think we're going to see changes especially related to chronic drug use, like certain drugs that are used for chronic disease. Those are going to be priorities. Other areas that they have focused on for priorities are rare diseases. Interestingly, the device center is not as front and center as drugs and food have been in terms of FDA policy right now. And so the biggest changes we're seeing in terms of FDA policy are around things like vaccines, rare disease approvals, kind of helping to think about whether, how many randomized clinical studies do you need for a rare disease product, if any. We've heard the FDA commissioner say that maybe in some cases it's impossible to have a full-blown clinical trial for, a disease where there's so few patients. So things like that are definitely shifting. And so I think the big uncertainty right now for companies is their reviewer still there? Right? Like, do they have somebody to call? And B, whether the agency, because of the changes in personnel, is going to shift more towards kind of a transactional posture instead of being able to kind of give feedback and handhold a little bit. FDA used to be very interactive, especially for products that are more innovative, that they've never seen before. That's the hardest thing to get through FDA, are the things that FDA has never seen before. I think under the circumstances right now, it may be that you're going to have to do a couple of rounds with the agency instead of a clock stop or a lot of interaction and getting it through the first try. I think that's going to be the biggest change. We're not seeing it yet because the reorg is still kind of underway, and the ultimate changes in leadership at a lot of the centers are kind of trickling down. But I think in 6 months, we will have a really good understanding of exactly how we have to change our strategy in terms of getting things through the agency.
So let me make sure I'm not misinterpreting. Because one thing I hear you say is that there's a greater focus on drug, maybe a less, or you're saying less impact on device. Does that mean that the timelines for device review are going to be longer?
No. No, absolutely not. So the
Okay.
timelines for review are dictated by the user fee programs,
Okay.
regardless.
Okay.
So the user fee programs are an agreement between FDA and industry, and industry pays what's called a user fee. And for example, for a 510K, it's around $25,000. You pay unless you're a small business, you pay your user fee, and at the FDA review is 90 days, including clock stops. Not including clock stops. So that is going to stay the same, regardless. The question is whether in that user fee dictated period, FDA is going to do everything they can to get your product to the market, or they're going to say, we have so many fewer people, we're still going to try to meet our user fee goals, but we're not going above and beyond. We're going to just meet the user fee goal, and we're going to issue a not approval or a not substantially equivalent or a complete response letter, and then you can submit again.
How is that different than the COVID years, when there were timeline concerns and a lot of issues around labor, personnel trying to get reviews done because of just the overall volume?
Well, so FDA did an amazing job in COVID, I will say. I think in that case, because it is a public health minded agency and that is their mission, you had folks working way over time. And we had Operation Warp Speed to get the vaccines to the market. And I think, and we had the emergency use authorization. And so that was actually a system where things worked very well. Things actually got through FDA way faster than you would think. I don't think there were as many concerns because they had enough people to do the work and they knew what the work was. Now, if you were a non-COVID related item during that time, I think it was a little bit more challenging. But in terms of the COVID related work, I think it actually went as well as it could have under the circumstances. Now, I think what you're dealing with is a situation where a lot of people who have a lot of institutional knowledge have left. There is a lot of the people that keep the freight moving, like the project managers, are not there. And so you have reviewers who are scientific experts having to do things like, send out correspondence and correspond with sponsors and schedule meetings and things that they didn't have to do before. And that's just going to slow things down. And so whereas before, maybe they could have spent extra time focusing on a novel scientific question, they may say, we can't possibly do that in the user fee dictated timeline. And so we're gonna give the company the feedback, take ourselves off the clock, and let them resubmit afterwards. So I think it remains to be seen, but the advice that is generally kind of coming out of the FDA bar is anything you send into the agency right now, it needs to be the minimum amount of information that you need in order to get your product through and really good. Like it cannot be that, it used to be that if you were an inexperienced company or a smaller company, FDA would help you, right? They would give you the benefit of the doubt. If, your data wasn't all there or you had questions that probably, maybe were beyond the scope of what should have been asked in a meeting, you can still submit them and get the feedback you need. That may not be the case anymore. There may be some review divisions that will still work that way, but I think it's better to work under the assumption that that is not the case and to ensure you have really good regulatory consultants, really good legal support, and put your absolute best foot forward with the agency, assuming that what you're trying to do is answer all of their questions in advance.
So you've got a lot of over-the-counter regulatory experience, and it's very recent. What are you seeing in the new administration that changes how that's going to play out?
There's a couple things. So the new administration is definitely has espoused the view that getting things over the counter is increased access for patients, which there are arguments on both sides of that, right? There's the idea that if a drug goes over the counter, then you have to pay for it out of pocket. It's no longer reimbursed by insurance. And so maybe that's increased access, but maybe it isn't. We saw that with the OTC switch of naloxone. The other, but the other side of it is if it's OTC, anyone can go get it, right? It's just going to be on the shelf in the health section of your pharmacy. So there's a couple things. One recent regulation that finally went into effect is the additional condition of non-prescription use rule, which is a rule that allows companies that couldn't get their products OTC on a label alone to introduce another kind of factor into the patient selection process to help patients select the right drug. So, for example, if you have like a statin or something that may have risk factors for certain patient types, you could create an online quiz that the patient takes that they have to answer the questions, and if they answer the questions in the way that is safe for them to use the drug, they get a code which they can then put into a kiosk or give to the pharmacist and then access the drug. I think we are going to see a lot of drugs using this pathway in the next couple of years. FDA definitely has some drug categories in mind that they really would like to switch to OTC. And so I do think we're going to see companies innovating in this space. There are some real questions inside of the ACNU rule, especially around generics, because the rule does allow the prescription generics to stay on the market, which is not consistent with previous views of OTC switch. And then there's also the question of how many of these different ACNUs a retailer can manage. Because if you've got patients coming in all the time, with different online quizzes, different kiosks, different questions for the pharmacist, what kind of burden does that put on the retailer? So I think that's going to be a place where we see a lot of change and a lot of innovation going forward.
How does favored nation pricing affect that?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
So explain favored nation pricing and what that means to consumers.
So favored nations pricing is a concept that was introduced in an executive order in the spring. And the idea is that the administration believes that the United States is footing the bill for research and development for drugs in a significantly greater way than other countries, because drugs that are sold, the same drug that's sold in another country is significantly less expensive. So for example, you hear a lot about drug importation from Canada because you can get drugs much cheaper on the Canadian market. That has significantly more to do with the way our health insurance system works than it does with the way that manufacturers set their prices. Nevertheless, the administration would like to ensure that the price that is offered for federal healthcare payments in the United States is no greater than the prices that are offered in other developed countries. So the policy, as it has been introduced, is to say that companies need to renegotiate their prices, and this is specifically with Medicare for the most part, to bring them down to the same level as they price them in other countries, mostly Europe. Think about Europe, Canada, and that's the concept. Whether this policy will actually ever be implemented is a totally separate question. It's unclear how the administration plans to go about doing this negotiation. Right now, they have indicated in the executive order that they want companies to come in and voluntarily price their products in a certain way. If you look at what happened under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the closest kind of the closest thing that we have to what they're doing under MFN, the IRA allowed the government to negotiate with manufacturers for pricing. And they've done 2 rounds of IRA negotiations. Every time the manufacturers have sued to say, the IRA does not apply to us, or you're not applying it correctly to our products. So it is not a willing kind of exercise. I mean, eventually they do come to the negotiating table and the negotiations happen, but it's not as voluntary as the administration suggests. And so the way that the EO for most favored nations was set up, it contemplates a voluntary lowering of prices. That seems unlikely to me. The other problem that they have is that Medicare is really their primary hook. And they've already got price negotiation in Medicare. So it's unclear kind of how that's going to play out. But that is what that kind of concept is. And it's been floated for a very long time in the United States. And there's a lot of reasons why it has not really taken hold.
Is that specific to only pharmaceuticals, or is that device as well?
It's specific to pharmaceuticals.
Okay. What are your thoughts on whether that would then bleed into other avenues in order to save the government money?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I don't know as much about device pricing in terms of kind of the overall cost to the government. I think drugs are just so much more expensive in terms of overall percentage of Medicare spend that the focus has been more on the drug side. So I don't see the device space being as heavily impacted, but that's not an area that I'm particularly familiar with.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about a lot of cardiovascular procedures. So if you need an LVAD and you're going to have surgery, if that is anywhere from between $800 and $1 million is what that reimbursement is to have that procedure done. So it makes sense to me that, considering the age and the reimbursement, that's an opportunity.
It may be. So interestingly, that's going to be under Medicare Part A. So anything that's in the hospital is a different reimbursement than Medicare Part B or Part D, which are really the kind of outpatient programs, and for pharmaceuticals certainly. I haven't seen these types of policies being advanced for inpatient procedures. I think there is a recognition that if you are sick enough to need that kind of care, that it should be paid for. And so I also think this is not my area. So I'm an FDA lawyer. I'm not a larger healthcare lawyer. So let's take this with that grain of salt. But I think if you look at the percentage of spend, prescription drugs are just significantly more than any of the rest of that. I think it's just not a pie. It's not a piece of the pie that needs to be addressed as acutely in terms of the opportunity to bring costs down.
No, that makes sense. I guess another thought that I would have on if you think about just pharmaceuticals and you think about the reimbursement and who takes up a percentage of that for society, is there much thought within the FDA in delineating between those in nursing homes and assisted living and then those that are getting their prescriptions and refills just on the market, let's say, through the standard brick and mortar pharmacy? Do they think about No. There's no difference in those patients. So.
No. Well, I mean, the difference, FDA is going to think about the difference in patients in terms of safety. If there is a safety impact on a particular patient population, you will see differentiation in the labeling. Or you would see something called a REMS, where, they have to deal with the risk mitigation. Once it's approved, pricing and reimbursement is CMS. FDA does not get involved in that. So no, they're not looking at those kinds of issues.
It just, I've hit that age where parental consulting and taking care of your loved ones is something that seems to be top of discussion at dinner tables around the country.
Yeah.
One thing that seems to be a very common discussion is how many products are being given to our elderly that they've been told we want them discontinued. So it's like once the refill machine gets moving, it's hard to get patients off of product. And so I view that as a real opportunity. And that's something that I've seen firsthand, but I also have so many discussions with other folks that are in their 50s and 60s that are dealing with the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I would think the FDA, that's an opportunity, you know?
Yeah, it is. So some of the thing you have to remember with FDA is their authorities are limited by statute. So there's only so much they can do once a drug is approved because they've reviewed the safety and effectiveness of the drug, they've assigned the labeling, and as long as the drug is being sold within the confines of the labeling, it's acceptable. So, but what you're hitting on is something that is clearly a focus of the current administration, because chronic use of the over-medicalization of the American public is something that HHS has made a lot of noise about recently, and it's in this Maha Commission report. I think what you will see is more safety reviews. So you will, FDA will undertake a review of like adverse event reporting and kind of, doing more to look at whether the chronic use of these products is appropriate, and then you may see a label change. But I would be very, very surprised if they try to withdraw products from the market, for example. I think that the bar to get that done is very high from an administrative law standpoint, and I think without clear safety issues, their authority is fairly limited.
No, that makes sense. Just so our audience is clear, when we talk about the Maha report in the committee,
yeah,
can you define that and kind of give some background on what the intention is there?
Sure. So there was an executive order that was issued on the day that Secretary Kennedy was sworn in as Health and Human Services Secretary, and they created this Make America Healthy Again Commission, so the Maha Commission. The commission was tasked with creating a report that was issued a certain number of days, I think it was 80 or 90 days after the creation of the commission, that outlines all of the priorities for kind of achieving the results of reducing chronic disease in the United States. So we got that report in mid-May. And then another period of time after that, I think it's 180 days from the formation of the commission, something around there, they're supposed to put together an actual execution plan for how they're going to get everything that's in their report done. And the interesting thing about the Maha Commission is it's made up of heads of lots of different agencies. So there's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, but the FDA commissioner is on there. You've got EPA, you've got USDA, lots of different areas of the government, because there are all sorts of things that affect human health that are not only regulated by FDA. So that's kind of the goal of that report. And it does give us a bit of a roadmap for kind of where the focus may be going forward.
Do hospitals have a representation on that committee?
That is a good question. I mean, I think that would be through CMS.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously a lot's been discussed around food dyes, additives, supplements. What's your thoughts on all of the discussion around that, the changes that are going to occur? Obviously this is probably something that you've got different clients that are having these discussions with you in your firm. What is your forecast?
Yeah, it's hard to tell right now how it's going to all play out. But there's a lot of rhetoric around petroleum-based food dyes. These are things like yellow number 2 and things like that are things that make Fruit Loops more appetizing looking and colorful. And there is a thought that those food dyes may contribute to chronic health issues. There's not as a clear-cut scientific evidence that that's the case, but there is a movement to remove those additives from the market. the process of doing that is long. There is a revocation process. It's an administrative process that FDA would have to go through. So right now, the agency is asking companies to voluntarily remove these products remove the food dyes from their products. Some are doing that. I think others are waiting to see. There is some reformulation going on. The other side of the coin is that some of the natural additives have other substances in them that may have allergy implications or that may not taste as good. And so it's a very challenging issue. Again, it's kind of fascinating to see how it's still government, right? And so the government has very clear processes it has to follow in order to make change. Change is slow in the government because it gives people a chance to weigh in. There's usually public comment or hearings or opportunities to review at every stage. And I think the current administration would prefer that was, a much faster process. And so we're seeing a lot of announcements that look very, very powerful coming out of the administration that then are very hard to implement because there are actual processes that have to be undertaken. So I think there is absolutely more focus on food right now than I've ever seen at FDA. Food was, previously very, very important, but foodborne illness was really the focus, right? The inspectorate, making sure that when you go eat a salad, the lettuce is clean, or, making sure that, adulterated food is not put out on your grocery shelves. Critically important. But the stuff around additives and supplements and the ingredients that go into food, like the generally recognized as safe process, is very technical. It's not something that's had a lot of attention. And so I do think there is an appetite for reform in those areas. I think the reform is a long-term process, which will, it will be very interesting to see what is able to be accomplished in, the period of time of Trump's term.
So we're sitting here in the middle of the research triangle.
Yes.
Which is, really the heart of big tobacco historically. Big tobacco had obviously a lot of lawsuits, and big money was generated through those lawsuits. Are we watching the food industry prepare for another big tobacco era?
So the thing with big tobacco is there was a very clear nexus between the product and health outcomes. I think that the administration is certainly teeing up an argument, and there are lawsuits already around this, that the food additives cause certain outcomes. But the science is not there yet. So I think ultimately this more relates to consumer choice. That if we educate our consumers better, if we give them healthier options, if we solve the food desert problem, there's a lot of effort around SNAP and making sure SNAP is supplemental nutrition program, which used to be called food stamps. So taking things like soda and candy out of SNAP is another initiative that we're seeing a lot of the states implement. So I do think that the threat of the plaintiff's bar in the way that kind of all of this is being carried out is real, because we're seeing that there are lawsuits being filed, and I think companies have to kind of contend with the optics risk, the actual regulatory risk, and the litigation risk. It all kind of goes together of putting a plan in place. It's extremely challenging. I think it's a really hard thing to navigate. And it's, we'll see who does it well, because it is going to be it's going to be really complex.
So obviously, a lot of law is based on precedent. So what precedent are you currently kind of looking at and getting comfortable with in comparing the two? I mean, where do you kind of is there a playbook that you can kind of go through and research in order to figure out the best forecast?
Well, it's interesting. So there was a long-standing legal doctrine under administrative law called Chevron. And Chevron gave a lot of deference to administrative agencies. The courts were not supposed to interfere if the agency made, a reasoned kind of decision. Chevron got overturned, and under a lawsuit called Loper-Bright. That has called into question areas where agencies may be overstepping their statutory authority. So, for example, if you look at what happened with the lab-developed tests rule, FDA recently announced that they are no longer going to pursue implementing this rule. The rule was predicated on FDA's idea that they could regulate these particular types of diagnostic tests that were done at CLIA-certified laboratories. The laboratories did not feel that they were within FDA's jurisdiction, and they kind of went back and forth for a long time. There was a bill introduced in Congress called the Valid Act, which failed, which didn't give FDA the authority to regulate these tests. So that gives you some hint, right? If there was legislation being introduced, why do they need legislation if they already had the authority? So there's this push and pull there. So the Valid Act failed. FDA came out and said, we didn't need the Valid Act. We're going to implement a rule. They got sued on the rule. And in the middle of that lawsuit, Loper-Bright happened. And I think without Loper-Bright, FDA may still have been fighting to say, no, we do have the authority. But under Loper-Bright, plus the regulatory regime that we're in right now, where we also have a deregulatory effort around agencies not implementing rules or withdrawing rules that they think go beyond their statutory authority, we're in an environment where that stuff is just not happening anymore. Okay. So I do think that is a good example. I think we're going to see other areas where FDA overstepping their authority or going beyond what the statute allows them to do. I think we will see lawsuits in that area because the groundwork has been laid to challenge them. And but in as is the case with every lawsuit, the facts have to be right, the posture has to be right. Sometimes you don't even get to the facts because the jurisdictional issues get in the way, or there's other technical legal issues that are very boring and don't actually have anything to do with what is going on in the actual lawsuit end up being the big argument. So I think we're going to see kind of how that all plays out. But the FDA space in terms of litigation is always interesting. There's always a crazy set of facts that pops up with different companies and different disputes and even with the agency. And so it's always an exciting kind of area to watch.
So I hear what you're saying, and one of the mental images that I have is a pendulum swing.
Yeah.
And so, we always talk about, where is the pendulum swinging, in what direction, and how does that affect decision making? How would you say the pendulum is swinging currently in what we're discussing?
So we are definitely seeing a deregulatory space. So that could be great for innovation. It also could be challenging for innovation. And the reason I say that is innovative products need help from FDA to get through the FDA process. They need feedback. They need a lot of the programs that are authorized under user fee agreements that allow for early interaction with the agency. We are seeing an effort to downsize user fee programs. So we're not seeing all the bells and whistles. User fees are being reauthorized in 2027. So the negotiations for medical device user fees, prescription drug user fees, generic drug user fees, all of those different programs have started. The agency has clearly communicated an intent to reauthorize user fees, which is good, but we don't know what those programs are going to look like. So, and we do know that they think they should be smaller. That's been very clearly communicated. So if that happens, you may have less ability to kind of interact with FDA early and kind of get their feedback earlier in the process. You also, deregulation also means less guidance. On the flip side, there may be pathways that were previously more challenging to get through that are less so because FDA is spending less time enforcing them or is spending less time worrying about kind of getting everything right in specific areas. So I think it's kind of hard to say with definity right now, but I think that the lack of guidance and the lack of kind of really robust user fee programs may end up being challenging for innovative companies.
So when you say innovative companies, that there's innovation within tradition, and then there's innovation that is completely its own avenue.
Right.
So when you say for innovative companies, I'm taking it within the traditional drug device model. But like a company that has a device that maybe it's a wearable device, maybe it's something that is tablet driven for folks with eye issues, and they're trying to improve a specific disorder with their eyes using new handhelds, or AI driven solutions. I can see AI being an avenue where the FDA will probably have to create a whole new division just to tackle that review process, and experts that have completely different skill sets. Give us some feedback on what are the law firms looking at to provide really good guidance on those types of innovations.
Yeah, that is an area that is very challenging. The AI is a great example of an area where FDA's paradigms are not really equipped to review those products. Software as a medical device generally has been a challenging area. I mean, FDA has kind of over the past 15 years put together a framework that I think is somewhat working. It's become at least predictable. Folks know how to navigate it. Maybe it's still very challenging, but there are ways through. And there's a lot of software-based products that FDA has said they're low risk, they're not going to worry about them. And that's, I think, been a huge benefit. Something that uses AI is going to be very hard to fit into FDA's framework, especially if there's no learned intermediary involved. So right now, the kind of paradigm, especially with software that helps with clinical decisions, is if there is a doctor, if you know what the algorithm is doing, like it's a transparent algorithm and you know what it's doing, and there's a doctor that reviews the output of that algorithm, so it's not making a decision directly for the patient, it's helping the doctor. That is considered to be lower risk, not without risk, but lower risk than something where the doctor isn't there. And obviously it depends on the disease state, right? And what the software is recommending you do. But I think, the idea of AI taking the place of the doctor is going to be very, very challenging for FDA, especially with, really having transparency with what the AI is doing. Is because, these AI models, they change over time. They're not static. It's not the same as an algorithm where there are certain inputs, it analyzes them the same way every time, and it spits out an answer. Like this is almost a living, breathing thing that will change over time. And so I think we will see a lot of interesting kind of regulatory change as products, really innovative medical products that are using those types of technologies come to the agency. And the one thing we do know is kind of the playbook around when you have new products, what happens at FDA. And there's always litigation, there is always legislation, there is always changes that go through, user fee reauthorizations. And so we will probably see that theme kind of carried out over the next 10 years until we get to a point where, it's very possible FDA needs new authorities in order to regulate this appropriately, or they need more staff, as you said, like they need a whole new division. So, it's right now, I think if you're a pioneer in that area, you're going to face more challenges. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's just kind of, how do you navigate it? And sometimes it is, as I was talking about, it's just putting the best argument out there. I think that's kind of what, certainly at a law firm, we're really looking at what is FDA saying and how do we read the tea leaves to kind of figure out how to put that really great argument out there and challenge the agency and keep things moving forward.
So with AI, How early should a company or a pioneer be reaching out to the agency in order to get guidance on what it's going to look like to actually submit? Because it seems like there's so much research that's done without any idea as to how they're going to submit. They're looking more of the problem solution, which is logical. I mean, that's common sense. You're trying to solve a problem, and you're doing it from a technical aspect. But if you can't get it through the FDA, then no one benefits. So is there ever, kind of a way for all these new pioneers to really interact with the FDA in a way that then they're not having to recreate the wheel at the end of the road?
For sure. So first of all, the most important question is, am I regulated by FDA? Right? Not all of these products are.
Good point.
So I think, and you get into big trouble when you think you're not regulated and you turn out to be. Like, that's also a very bad, that's like a worst case scenario, right? You're going along and you're like, I've got this product, I'm going to launch it. And then all of a sudden you get, your marketing an unapproved medical device kind of letter. That's bad. So you definitely want to know. And the interesting thing with software is there's a line, right? Sometimes you can stay on this side of the line and you're not regulated. Sometimes if you want to make certain claims or you want to add certain bells and whistles, you're going to pass into regulated territory. So I think knowing where all those lines are, critical first step. And if you really don't want to be regulated, figuring out if you've got a business case for staying in the unregulated space. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. You're like, nope, I want to be in this super high risk, like I want to be in a cardiovascular area, or I want to be in cancer. And like, yeah, you're going to be regulated. Like it's just too risky for the patient. But then, yes, you can go and do the pre-submission program and talk to FDA at very early stages. And that is always encouraged because it's exactly as you said. Like, you don't want to go to FDA when you've already baked your product and they're like, you can't do any of this, right? That's like never a good idea. Or thinking you don't need a clinical study and you do. That can set your program back very, very far. So really understanding, like, what is the testing? Is there a predicate, right? Are you going to do 510K, or are you going to have to do a de novo? Or is this a PMA and you're going to have to do a full-blown clinical study? What is the agency going to be looking at? I don't think we have like really granular guidance on kind of what they would be looking at in these particular. I mean, there is guidance on AI and ML, but it's not as robust as maybe you would necessarily need for something that's super kind of far-reaching. So getting in there and also kind of, as I said before, really doing your homework before you go in. So kind of knowing what pathway you want to go down and why you're justified in going through that pathway, and what is going to get you there, and putting that, making that case for the agency kind of very early on, and then getting their feedback, I think is really important.
And that's something that your team does, right? I mean, your team can take a client and try to do that research to figure out what is the right pathway.
We certainly could. We can help them find the right person. I mean, I am not an engineer, so sometimes I can be helpful. Sometimes I just know people who also can be helpful, and it's more kind of strategically, how do you position this product to make sure that it's going to be successful, and kind of understanding all of the different aspects of the ecosystem in which the business is going to operate to position it best with the agency and then the larger market.
So I'd like to go back to something we were discussing earlier, because I think it's just so interesting with the change in having a new secretary over the agency, in HHS. Kind of give me your thoughts on where we are right now with him and all the major changes that he's made. Where do you see kind of his personal fingerprints on the program and where that's going to take things? I mean, because it's very individually driven, the way things are being done right now.
Yes, I think that's true. I think, it's interesting. The Secretary of Health and Human Services has not historically been as involved at a granular level with the FDA as this one is. Like, Secretary Kennedy really cares a lot about issues that are squarely in FDA's wheelhouse. So you will even see the FDA commissioner at announcements that don't really have anything to do with FDA. Like, FDA is clearly part of the inner circle at HHS, and it's very, very important. So that is good for the agency in the sense that, they will get the support and the attention that, he wants to give. But it also means that the FDA commissioner's priorities may be overruled by the secretary's priorities in certain circumstances. So, I don't know if the current FDA commissioner, is as passionate about food issues as Secretary Kennedy is. But food is clearly a huge priority. And they have a new deputy commissioner for human foods. And he has been very front and center in terms of the work that he's doing, meeting with industry and, moving things along in the human foods program. So, that's definitely an area where it was very important also under the past administration, but I think we see it much more front and center now. We are seeing the agency kind of start to roll out more projects that are kind of driven by some of the priorities that the secretary has advanced. The other thing that I think is fascinating about the way FDA is working now is it's a much more podium policy driven organization than it has been in the past. The previous administrations had much more controlled communications. And the policy was not announced at speeches at conferences. Okay. That is what's going on right now. We're learning, if you really want to know what's going on at FDA, you have to be paying attention to kind of what is the commissioner saying on CNBC and on Fox News, and what's he saying at different conferences, and who is he speaking to? Like right now, we've got the FDA commissioner doing a countrywide tour to meet with CEOs of pharma companies. We've never seen this before. So it's a really different style. And so it's also really helpful in kind of watching what is going on there to really understand what FDA is doing. And so that's, I think, the biggest change in terms of kind of how the secretary is rolling out his agenda. Is it's much more informal and it's much more public in the way that it's being done.
So transparency has increased dramatically, at least at the top.
Yeah, and access. I would say access to
ask questions.
To the leadership. Yes.
So the one thing that I would say over the election time period was this versus the rest of the world's how they view foods, how they view different products from a healthcare standpoint, and their regulatory environment towards approving them and having them available to their societies. So we've always been viewed as being a lot more strict in certain aspects. But during the election process, it was, well, the rest of the world doesn't allow these dyes and additives and everything else versus we do. Do you see us being more, is the pendulum going to where we're going to behave more like Europe? Or is the pendulum where we're going to go down a path that no one's taken?
I think most likely it's going to be more like Europe. Okay. Europe is just ahead in terms of the conservatism that they use on certain safety issues. And we see that kind of throughout regulated product categories. It's not just food. The interesting thing is that the United States is set up in a very different way from a legal standpoint. And so the administrative processes that they would have to undertake in order to really get to the place where Europe is are pretty arduous. And generally speaking, an FDA commissioner or a secretary of Health and Human Services picks one or two of these big ticket issues and they make it their singular focus to get through during a particular term. And that's how things get achieved. We're not seeing that level of organization in the current climate. We're seeing a lot of different things being announced and with little to no understanding of how they're going to be implemented. And so I think we have to kind of let the dust settle a bit, and then eventually it's going to become clear, like, what are the things that they're really going to try to get through. And some of this is going to have to involve Congress, which also makes it more complex.
Considering what we've discussed, what are some of the avenues that your clients are the most concerned about, that you're giving the most guidance and direction to make sure that their investments are sound, that they're making good decisions, and that they're able to meet their objectives?
So I think that one of the top things is whether FDA is going to continue to meet its user fee goals. There have been a number of examples recently where FDA has not met user fee goals for drug products. There's been a lot of uncertainty around vaccines. We've seen a very big shift in the standard of approval for certain vaccines. So I think that has been a big question, and how do you navigate that? And some of that is kind of baking those expectations into external communications. For example, if you're publicly traded and you don't really want to go tell investors that something is very certain with FDA when we can't actually be certain that things are going to happen in the same way that they did before. So I think some of that is just good planning. Because the other thing is it eventually works out, right? It's not that like everything has ground to a halt. It's just different than the way that it used to be. And so it's important to acknowledge that and not try to do things in the exact same way that you've always done them before. I think that's where you can create a lot of problems. And then the other piece of it really is whether, are folks still there? What happened to my project? And, is anyone going to be there to review it? And how do I've got a clinical trial that's in the middle of enrollment, and who do I send my clinical study report to, and all of that. So I think, and in that vein, like, are they going to accept my study design that I've, worked many, many years to implement? So I think that uncertainty that's harder. If you're starting from scratch right now, then you just approach the agency in its current form, right? Like it's different, but it's still there. I think there at the beginning of back in February, there was kind of a question of like, are we just entering into a whole new world? Like, is this really that different? I don't think we have gotten to that point. I don't think we are in just such a different world. It's like, we're not walking on the moon. We're just kind of, you have to be prepared in a different way. And so that's the, and kind of watching what's coming out of the agency very, very closely, especially similarly situated products, any feedback that's been given in those areas, really learning from the people who came before you. That's critically important. So it's really kind of making sure the approach is right.
I've learned a lot, and this will be one of those that I can go back and use as kind of a reference for a lot of answers in the future. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would really want, either potential clients to be aware of, or just opportunities that, your firm can provide answers or solutions to that we haven't discussed?
Well, I think generally speaking, the view of regulatory lawyers sometimes is, well, they're going to read the regulations and tell me what I can't do. But the value of a regulatory lawyer can be much, much more than that. And so from my perspective, what I think, especially operating in the current environment, it's really important to get great regulatory advice that also takes the business risks into account. And so kind of looking at enterprise level risk, understanding how the C-suite's goals or the board's goals also fit into the regulatory paradigm. That's really what I'm focused on, and making sure that the best outcome for the business is achieved. And so, it's not only just, what does it say in the Code of Federal Regulations, it's also kind of how do you use the current regulatory structure to the greatest advantage. And there are new and innovative ideas out there that, and different regulatory strategies that we can use in the current environment that maybe were not opportunities before.
That makes sense. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much
Appreciate
for having
it.
me.
Absolutely. That's it. Thank you.